Hello and welcome to this PIR live event webinar brought to you by Partners in Research Canada. We are celebrating World Oceans Day today. My name is Stacey Joyce and I will be your host. Remember that you can ask questions anytime throughout the webinar by clicking the Q&A button near the top left of your screen if you're joining us live and typing your questions into the pop-up window. I'll relay those questions to our guests when we get to the Q&A section of our webinar. If you include your name, your school, or your city, I will be sure to give you a shout out when I relay your question. So today's guest is Sheryl Murdock. She is a graduate student in Earth and Ocean Sciences at the University of Victoria, and she is funded by the Canadian Healthy Oceans Network. Thank you so much for joining us today. I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Stacey. I'll just get my screen up here. Hello, everybody. Happy World Oceans Day. Let's get my slides up and going. Okay. So as you can see, we're going to talk a little bit about ocean health and deep sea ecosystems today on this World Oceans Day. So Stacey told you a little bit about me. I'm a graduate student in the University of Victoria, and I've been working in deep sea ecosystems for about 20 years now, and I've just decided to go back to school. For those of you who don't know what an ecosystem is, that's just what we call something in nature, a natural system that has a lot of living things in it, but there's a lot going on that doesn't have to do with the living things as well. There's a lot of things about the natural chemicals and things like that and how they all interact. And so part of what I do is try and understand how those ecosystems work in the deep sea. So we'll move right into it. So the reason we need to have a World Oceans Day is because if you were to go out into space and look at the planet, you would see that most of it is covered in oceans, about 70% of it, in fact. And for the grade 3s who maybe haven't learned about percentages yet, it's just a way of saying more of our planet is covered in ocean than land. So it's pretty important to celebrate those oceans a little bit and try to take care of them. But also, the oceans contain a lot of what we call biodiversity, which is just all the different species that are in the ocean, all the different things that live there. There's big things and small things and things you recognize like fish and things you don't recognize like strange little worms and things that are so small you can't even see them without a microscope. The point is that there is a lot of life in the oceans, and scientists actually a few years back, did what's called a census, where they went and tried to count as many species as they could in the ocean, and they found thousands of new species in this 10-year census, and we're still finding more. So the point is that the ocean has a lot of life in it, and a lot of things we don't even know about, and that's kind of worth celebrating on World Oceans Day. But the other thing is something we talked about, ecosystems. Well, ecosystems can provide things for the inhabitants, the things that live in them. So if you think of what the ocean does for the planet, because our planet is so much covered in ocean, the inhabitants are, of course, us and all the other living things you see around you. And the oceans do some really important things in keeping the health of our planet moving along in the right direction. So the ocean does things like moderate temperature by all the ocean currents moving the heat from the equator up to the poles and cycling things around. But also the living things in the surface of the ocean, the small microscopic plants, they provide us with most of the oxygen that we breathe, more so than all the trees you see around you. They also take a lot of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. You may have heard a bit about that with people talking about climate change and all the things that we humans are doing to the environment. We're putting a lot of extra carbon dioxide, that's CO2, into the atmosphere. And the oceans help take a lot of that out for us. But they're also a source of food. A lot of us like to eat fish and shellfish. And a lot of our medicines, some of our medicines have come from the oceans. And there's a lot of potential, we think, for living things in the ocean that might also produce new medicines we haven't discovered yet. And my favorite is just, it's a source of recreation. I don't know about anybody else, but I love to go to the beach. I love to be out in the ocean. It's my happiest place in the whole world. And, and so without healthy oceans, the world becomes a less livable, habitable place. So really, we can celebrate that today on World Oceans Day. So just to tell you a little bit about World Oceans Day, so the theme for it this year is Our Oceans, Our Future. And so you see that all of these things that the ocean provides to us make sure that we have a long and happy future. And so the goal of World Oceans Day from the beginning has been to educate people about the importance of protecting the oceans for all of those reasons that I just mentioned to you, but also encouraging everyday people to act towards protection. So making small changes in your own life that take care of the oceans, being aware of not throwing your plastic out because it ends up in the oceans, things like that. And just a little history of World Oceans Day. The United Nations finally recognized it in 2008, but Canada was actually a leader in proposing World Oceans Day back in 1992, which makes this the 25th anniversary of World Oceans Day. So happy birthday, World Oceans Day, quarter of a century. So Canada is still being a leader in ocean protection, and one of their goals that they've set out for right now is to protect 10% of our oceans by 2020. So that's only 2.5 years from now, and right now we only have 1% of our oceans that are protected. We call them marine protected areas, or MPAs, I'll probably call them. So Canada is really doing a lot to protect our oceans because we know they're part of our future. So the work I do is with the Canadian Healthy Oceans Network, and we also partner with Fisheries and Oceans Canada to look at how we maintain healthy oceans by conserving them, but also making sure that we can still use them. Conservation doesn't mean you can't go there, you can't fish there. It means let's make sure we do it in a way that preserves it for our children and their children and their children. And we want to do that by using strong science to understand those ecosystems first before we protect it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the area that I work in, which is a deep sea ecosystem. So when I say deep sea, maybe not everybody understands what that means. So how deep is deep? If you were to look at a little picture of the ocean, I've covered most of it up right now, and that little brown spot on the left, that's the land. And the area below that dotted line, that's what we call the surface ocean. And that's the area that the sun reaches. But most of the ocean, that's kind of the sunlit area, is kind of where scuba divers would be stuck. Although you wouldn't even be able to see him, he'd be so small. But most of the ocean is very, very, very much deeper than that. In fact, the deepest spot in the ocean is about 11,000 meters. So if the sun only reaches 200 meters, that's a lot of ocean that is in the dark. And so we need some really special equipment to get down there and do science. Things like remotely operated vehicles. So this is one of Canada's best remotely operated vehicles. Its name is Robos. So we go out on a ship. You can see the bow of the ship there at a big crane, and we lower this vehicle down to the bottom of the ocean and drive it kind of like a remote control car. So there's nobody in this remotely operated vehicle. That's why we call it remote. We drive it from up on the ship. But there are some that you can actually go inside to go to the bottom of the ocean. The nice thing about working in a deep sea ecosystem is it's really far from humans. So it's kind of what we call pristine. It hasn't been quite so affected by human impacts yet. So if you were to look at a map of the world and you drain away all of the oceans, you'd see these very, very, very deep basins. So all of the dark blue in the map here that you can see is the deepest parts of the oceans, the dark parts. The light blue is the shallows. And the white lines that are drawn around here are showing this mountain range that goes all around the bottom of the ocean called Midocean Ridge system. It's like a big mountain chain. And it moves it goes all around the planet. And we've just drawn lines on it here so you can see it. And what's happening is that's where the crust of the Earth is made of different pieces, and they're all kind of moving. And so along those white lines, those pieces of crust are moving apart, and we're creating new seafloor. So I'm going to show you a little bit about this area here in the square that's off the coast, the west coast of Canada where I live. And this is the area that I work on. And so it's called the Endeavour hydrothermal vents. That MPA means marine protected area. So I'll tell you what a hydrothermal vent is in a minute. But so there's a map here showing the west coast of Canada. The little circle there is where I am in Victoria. So out off our coast, there's one of those spreading areas where the plates are moving apart and new seafloor is being created. And what happens is that the seawater that's down in the rocks gets exposed to really hot magma down in the crust, kind of like lava. And it makes the water so hot that it rises up really quickly. and it creates these really cool, what we call chimneys. So the black smoke you can see here is actually just hot, hot, hot water, about 350-degree water. Just for reference, your oven at its hottest only goes to about 260 degrees Celsius. And on the edges of this, where the water is not quite so hot, it's just warm, you get all sorts of interesting life. So you get these little worms, all of that white stuff, that's bacteria. That's the stuff I love. It's kind of weird, but I love it because it's really what gets this whole system going. So I have one more little video for you here that shows these are the communities that I'm working in. These are called tube worms. You can see their bright red plumes there. They're filtering food out of the water. And there's all sorts of other living things in there. That shimmering that you can see is where warm water is coming out from in the crust, and it's mixing with cold water, and it makes it look kind of wobbly. You can do this in your kitchen and mix really hot water into cold, and you'll see that effect as well. So what I'm trying to study is how the microbes that live in these really interesting animal communities, how they all work together. So this Endeavour hydrothermal vents area off the coast is so deep that it's very different from life on the surface. So life at the surface needs sunlight for energy, and we call that process photosynthesis, right? Photo means light. So they use light for energy. But where I'm working in this hydrothermal vents area, this is 2,200 meters down, no sunlight. So life down there has to live off of chemical energy, and that we call that chemosynthesis. The chemo means chemicals. And so it's the microbes, these little things that are so small you can't see them without a microscope. They're the smallest living things that we know of. They're really the base of all of these animal communities. So the picture on the left here is actually one of those chimneys, not a super hot one, it's a bit cooler, and it looks like rock. Excuse me. It's not, it's completely covered in life. It's covered in tube worms and little limpets and snails and a whole bunch of really small things. Every inch of that is covered in life. And the picture on the right is one of those tube worm communities, and we're actually sitting at, our ROV is sitting at it, just about to take a sample. So the microbes down here are what support those really big communities of life. And microbes are so cool, I could talk about them all day because they're really everywhere. They're in your mouth, they're on your hands, they're on your chair, they're on the bus handle, you know, the door handles, they're on the bus seats, they're in the soil, they're everywhere. And most of them don't harm us. They're actually pretty helpful in a lot of cases. And in the case of our hydrothermal vents in the deep ocean, they're actually the keys to life. They're how everything works up. They're what supports that whole big ecosystem. So what I'm trying to understand is if you look at one of these tube worm communities, so all these long straight things, these are tube worms, and you can kind of see some fuzz on them. Those are microbes. So I know I said that they were so small you couldn't see them without a microscope, but in this case, those little fuzz strands are hundreds and hundreds of microbes all chained together to make them look big enough that you can see them. So all of these critters in here, tube worms, snails, there's some crabs in there, limpets, all these things, they all live together, and we're trying to figure out in a community how that works. So if you think about the community that you live in, everybody has a job. You have doctors, you have grocers, you have librarians, teachers, and you know what all of them does. So the question is, if one of them suddenly can't do their job anymore, how does your community continue to function? And does it matter which person disappears? If your grocer disappears, you could probably train somebody new. It would take a while, but you could do it. If your doctor disappears and you're in a small community with only one doctor, you might not have anyone to take care of you when you get sick. So there's certain functions in your community that are really important. They're all important to make it work, but some are more crucial than others. And so this is what I'm trying to understand about deep sea ecosystems is how do all the people work together? Not people, all of the critters work together. So when we're looking at protecting forming marine protected areas, what I'm trying to understand if it's more important to look at what everybody does versus who's there. So am I going to protect diversity or the function of the community? So by understanding how that community works, I can look at what would happen if some sort of stress happened, because of course our oceans are getting a bit stressed these days. There's a lot of things changing in our environment. We want to know how, if we stress the ocean, how does the life in it respond? Is it still going to be able to function? And so if we can protect against certain stresses that are going to have a greater impact on, say, functions that are only possibly done by a few species, like maybe your doctors, so to speak, the doctors of the deep sea, they're not doctors. But if there are functions that are really important and only a few species do them, we want to maybe protect them a little more carefully. But yet, if there are things that can be done by many different species, we can look at that as the community being able to withstand that stress a little bit. So we're trying to understand that, because if we want to protect parts of the ocean, we want to do it thoughtfully. We don't just want to randomly protect places, because these places, we want to be able to use them still for science, for research in shallow areas. We want to look at them for fishing and things like this. So we don't want to just randomly protect places. We want to be careful about thinking about the what, the why, and the how. So why is an area, what area is at risk? Why is it at risk? Why does it need protection? Are there certain things that are uniquely done? So you can look at certain stresses. So if you go back to your community thinking, like a stress, like if we take all of your coffee out of your community, would the parents still be able to get up and take their kids to school? Maybe not. So certain functions are a little more crucial than others, and those are the ones, and the areas that perform those, we need to protect those a little bit better. So we have to protect effectively. So really, if we're going to talk about protecting our oceans so we can protect our future for all of you, we want to make sure that we understand it first. So that's kind of the summary, and I'll say thanks and happy World Oceans Day to everyone, and leave you with this beautiful octopus that we saw at sea last year.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. And before you pull down your slides, I actually had a question coming from the grade 3s and 4s at Chinook Park School about your microbe slide. Yeah. They were wondering what the green dots were.
Oh, well, the green dots are in a lot of the slides, actually. Even if you can see the green dots on the octopus right now, those are lasers on the front of our research vehicle, our remotely operated vehicle that we use, and we point them so that we can always tell how big things are. So wherever you see those two green dots, they're always 10 centimeters apart. So that octopus, you can tell how big he is by where those two green dots are on him. So you can say that amount is 10 centimeters, so he's about this big. It's not very big, but he's very cute.
What a wonderful little idea that is simple, but probably so, so useful.
Very useful, yes. We use that a lot.
Next, I have a question from Waterloo, Ontario, in Mr. Chidiak's class. Have you come across any creatures that had not been discovered yet?
All the time. The thing with microbes is that most of them are not well known. So because I deal with mostly microbes, much of what I'm doing is using DNA. So it's that part of you that sort of codes for who you are. It's kind of like the instructions for a living thing. That's what we use to understand and identify most of the microbes in the ocean. And many of the things that we get back are not well known. So part of our job is to try and understand them, study them, characterize them. We did, one of the samples we took last summer, I am told the other person that I work with who's looking at the animals found a fairly rare, potentially new species of, I think it was a brittle star or something, and it was just tiny, tiny, tiny. So every time we go in the ocean, we find new species, pretty much every day.
That's kind of amazing. Something new all the time. Yes. Next, we have a question from the grade 2s at Auburn Bay School. They are wondering how you take notes underwater for your research.
Well, I don't actually go underwater, because if you remember that map I showed you with the little scuba diver up at the top, just that tiny little top of the ocean is the only place that you can go down in the water yourself without being in something like a submarine. So I wouldn't go down and take notes in the water. If I do go down, I would go down in a submarine. So I'm actually dry. I'm in a really cramped little space though with 3 of us. It's probably like the size of the trunk of your car. and there's 3 of us in there, so we're sitting all cramped up with our knees and we're taking notes. But most of the time I sit on a ship and I watch on a bunch of screens while some pilots drive the submarine down at the bottom, and I sit comfortably on the ship with my cup of coffee and my notepad.
That sounds a little better than trying to write underwater.
Yes.
Okay, let's see. We have a couple questions about the Yeti crab coming from Calgary.
Calgary.
Where did the Yeti crab get its name? And also, how often do you use the Yeti crab?
Well, I don't use the Yeti crab. I don't believe they exist in the area that I'm working. My understanding is that a lot of it came from the fact that it has these hairy long arms that sort of look like, you know, the Yeti, Bigfoot. He's got all of these different names. And this crab actually uses these hairs on its arms to grow bacteria that it then feeds on. So it basically has a little garden on its hairy arms, and it uses that to grow its own food and then pick it off and eat it as it goes, I'm told. I don't study them specifically, but I like that they have their own little microbe garden.
I'm pretty impressed that the students there knew about that. I did not know about the Yeti crab, so I learned something today. Thank you.
And I did not mention it, just popped up in the corner, so well done at knowing what that was.
Yeah, thanks for teaching me something today from the grade 3-4s at Chinook Park School, and I think maybe a little information from you, Sheryl, along the way. Next, we have a question from Seneca Trail Public School in Oshawa, Ontario. They're asking how often you go to the bottom of the ocean.
I have only been there myself one time. And I'll tell you, it's an experience that I would never trade for anything. It was the most amazing thing I've ever done, but it was cramped and cold and uncomfortable. And there's no washroom. And you're on the bottom. Your whole trip is about 8 hours, 8.5 hours. So how long can you hold not having to go to the washroom? It was an amazing thing. Once you started to go down into the dark and suddenly all of these little lights start sparkling in the deep of things that bioluminesce, they create their own light. Absolutely the most amazing experience I've ever had, but I've only been once. It might have been enough.
Yeah. Next, we have a question from Forest Manor Public School in Toronto. They're asking, how will the ecosystem be affected by the temperature change due to the Arctic melting from global warming?
So that's one of the nice things about the study that I'm trying to do in the deep ocean. Because it's 2,200 meters down, the temperature change isn't really felt that much in the deep Pacific. And that's because when a lot of the ice melts, the very cold water does sink to the bottom of the ocean and travel around, but it typically sinks down and starts moving through the Atlantic first and kind of goes around all the other oceans before it makes its way up to the Pacific. So the temperature change, once it gets all the way there, which could take 1,000 years, is pretty small. And again, we're very far from the surface. So the reason that I'm studying how an ecosystem functions and how to conserve it is because this place that I'm studying is actually pretty unaffected by all of our climate change so far. And we're trying to see what happens. What can we learn about an ecosystem that isn't being stressed very much yet? And then how can we apply that to places on the surface or the coast? This is part of the CONI project, is people are looking at many other ecosystems on coastal areas and near surface and things like this. Can we apply what we've learned in this really pristine deep sea ecosystem to shallower places that are going to be a lot more impacted by our changing climate?
Very interesting. Next, I'm changing gears a little. We have a question from the grade 3s at Hawkwood School, also in Calgary. And I think they're looking at the lab behind you. They're asking, what equipment do you use to do your research?
Well, I'll tell you, when I'm out on the ship, we do a lot with ships, and we do a lot with remotely operated vehicles. That's how we get our samples. But once they come back here, a lot of what I do, I spend a bit of time here in the lab, and I probably use all of this mess a bit. We use things like pumps where we can filter all these little microbes onto a little plastic filter and put it in our freezer until we get back here to the lab. And then we extract its DNA out and we work with its DNA. But most of what I do now, once I get my samples and I send them off and I get my sequences back, my DNA sequences, so my instructions on those microbes and how I identify them, I spend a lot of time sitting at my computer. Much of the work I do is computer, it's coding. So if you're interested in coding, that's a good thing. Learn a lot about computers and computer coding because it's going to be really useful if you ever want to be a biologist.
That's pretty amazing because it's not necessarily intuitive. If you love to study biology, that learning to code and program computer programs would be useful.
Mm-hmm. A lot of what we do to understand how those ecosystems work has to do with computer modeling and making up a little computer scenario where you say, okay, now I'm going to change something. What happens to the system? And a lot of it is just sort of thought exercises and things like that. But we couldn't do all of that without going out in the field and collecting samples and learning about the environments that I love. These deep sea environments are places that I've loved to study since I wanted to study them when I was in grade 3. And I saw them in National Geographic and I said, that's what I want to do.
And let's see, we have lots of questions waiting here, so I'm trying to see how many of them I can get to. We have 2 sort of related questions from 2 different classes here. Forest Manor wants to know how we can know how deep the seafloor is if people have not been down that far. And we've got our class in Waterloo asking, how deep can you take the submersible? Is there a limit?
So we do know how deep the ocean is because people have been there. The deepest place, Challenger Deep, was visited previously, but with remote vehicles and things. But recently, James Cameron, the man who was responsible for movies like the Titanic and things like this, but he's also done a lot with underwater filming. He built his own submersible and went down to Challenger Deep to almost 11,000 meters. And he said it was very quiet and very barren. So there wasn't a lot to see. There was a few critters living down there, but we have done a fair bit of mapping of the ocean. We can do that sometimes with ships can drive over the ocean, and we have things called sonar. So they put little pings of sound down into the ocean, and when they bounce back, that's how we can create maps of the seafloor. So ships have driven around and mapped areas of the seafloor, and we can know how deep they are, but we've actually only mapped maybe 5% of the seafloor. So there's a lot we don't know about the ocean, especially the deeper areas. But we do know the deepest point, and somebody has been there. The deepest that the vehicles can go to, the special one that James Cameron built was meant to go to that depth. Most of the remotely operated vehicles we work with go to about 5,000 or 6,000 meters. I think that may also be the limit of the manned submersibles. Might be a little shallower than that.
So next we have a question from Chinook Park School in Calgary again, asking if you work with any botanists working on underwater plants.
I don't, because most of the marine plants live in that really shallow surface part of the ocean. They need to be up where the sunlight is. Those ocean plants need that sunlight to do photosynthesis. So where I work in the deep, there are not really any plants. There's a lot of animals and a lot of little critters that are small, like even some of the microscopic plants that you would see on the surface, but they don't use sunlight. So they're not plants, they're not algae. So no, I don't work with any botanists.
So there are these people working on plants, but you're working in deep sea, so you're not really working together. Do I understand that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Our 2 focuses are quite different.
So I want to squeeze in a couple more questions here. First, you did talk about how you knew you wanted to study this type of thing since grade 3, but the grade 2s at Auburn-based school are asking, what do you need to use from school to do your job now? So we did talk about coding. What other skills did you have to learn along the way in school? And maybe you can tell us a bit about what that educational path has been so far.
Well, really, math and science are the big ones. So if you love science and you love nature and learning about the world around you, that's honestly, there's a lot of schooling needed, but I think to really love learning about nature is huge, because if you love learning about nature, then you love learning about biology and chemistry and physics and how the world works around you. So all of those math and science classes that you're gonna experience as you go through your schooling, those are really important. But again, like I said, computer information as well, which is not something I had much of as a kid. That's something I'm learning now. So I went through and got my university degree in oceanography. And oceanography looks at not only biology, but chemistry and geology and physics and all of these other things. And they all, because in the oceans, all of those different components work together. So love of nature, love of science, math helps, computers help.
There are lots of skills then along the way that you had to pick up and are still learning.
Yes, yes. It's never ending.
All right. Well, the grade 3s at Hawkwood want to ask about those tube worms. And they're wondering how many of them live together in a group.
Whoa. Well, one of the people that I'm working with is actually, we went and took some, what we just call them grab samples. We literally take the ROV arm out and we come and we grab around the base of the tube worm bush, and we take only part of it. And she's actually counting everything in it. Everything. And it's taking her forever. So a lot of the bushes can be quite large, but in some cases they cover entire chimneys, entire sides of chimneys. Thousands and thousands of worms. And there's the big ones, but there's also lots of teeny tiny little ones that are growing at the base, and they're all going to sprout up and become adults at one point. So I couldn't give you a number, but a lot. There are a lot of those worms down there.
Okay, let's see. A couple questions about climate change again. So the students are wondering if the ocean gets deeper and deeper every year because of climate change, and how can you tell if the ocean is stressed?
So the ocean doesn't get any deeper or shallower. Well, I guess that's not technically true. As our sea levels rise, because ice is melting, yes, it's getting a little deeper. But if you think about, the ocean is 11,000 meters deep, and when sea level rises from all the ice melting, it might rise by 1 to 2 meters. The depth change is pretty small. We'll notice it more on land than the ocean will. The ocean won't notice it so much. And I forgot the second part of the question.
How do you tell if the ocean is stressed?
Well, that's a really good one, because that's part of what we're trying to understand. There's a lot of people working on that, because the ocean is so important to how our whole Earth ecosystem works. We're trying to understand when it is stressed. Things we can tell that are most obvious are things like coral reefs all dying off. And that's because there's so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The ocean's trying to take it all up, and what it's doing is it's making the ocean more acidic, which means that the coral reefs can't build their shells anymore, because they need the pH a little bit higher. So that's a stress that we can tell the ocean is stressed, because the things that are living in it are having trouble surviving. So when we talk about stress, well, does the ocean itself get stressed? Does the water get stressed? No, but everything living in it starts to feel stress. You start to see ecosystems change and die off, and you see species go extinct. So the ocean and all of its inhabitants are becoming stressed. And a lot of that we can really see already. Like I said, our coral reefs are really dying off pretty drastically.
Well, I know we're already over time here, so maybe just one last general question for you. In that, do you have anything that you would like to share with our audience that we haven't yet talked about, or any advice for students who may want to pursue a similar avenue to you?
Well, I would say that if you are really, really interested in learning about the world around you, follow that passion. Do what you love. Study what you love. That's what I did. I found the thing that I thought was the most interesting thing I'd ever seen in the whole world, and decided I would do whatever I could to get to that path. Everything worked out pretty well, but ask questions, talk to scientists, talk to people at universities, join science groups, get involved, really. If there's something that you think you want to study, find a way to get involved in it early on. There's a lot of opportunities out there.
Excellent. Well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Sheryl, for joining us and answering our questions about deep sea ecosystems.
Thanks, Stacey. This was a lot of fun. I'm glad everybody tuned in today.
And next on PIR Live Event, we're going on a virtual laboratory tour with Dr. Maria DeRosa at Carleton University. More information on this and other upcoming webinars is available at pirweb.org. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.